In this video, Jordan Peterson explains why you need to establish a value system that works for you as well as the society around you.
So far what we've been doing is laying out an argument that you inhabit what you might describe as a frame of reference or a story, or that you're occupied by sequential sub-personalities. That's another reasonable way of thinking about it. Might be the most reasonable way of thinking about it, really. And that these frames of reference or sub-personalities have a point of view and associated thoughts and associated memories, and that most importantly, perhaps, as well as directing your behavior and emotions, they also structure your perceptions. And I think that's the most critical, that's the most critically important realization about the frames that you bring to bear on the world, because it's through them that the world manifests itself. And what that means to some degree is that you have an indeterminate role to play as a consequence of your moral choices, because these are essentially value-based structures. As a consequence of your moral choices, you determine to an indeterminate degree the manner in which the world manifests itself to you. So in that sense, you're a co-creator of your own being, and then you're also a co-creator through your action and your communication for the being of other people as well, and for the external world insofar as you act upon it. So it's a non-trivial realization to understand that to what degree your value structures filter the world for you and shape it. And so we've been talking so far about the structure of that world, and I introduced some neurophysiological ideas last time, the idea being that you come into the world obviously embodied with a set of inbuilt, we'll call them sub-personalities, at hand. Most of them, those are regulated by very archaic, ancient brain systems that you share with many other creatures on the evolutionary chain, which is partly why you can communicate with and understand other creatures, because if you didn't share that underlying biological structure, they would be opaque to you in the same way that perhaps an octopus is relatively opaque to you. You can't understand it because you don't share an embodied platform, and its experience is therefore entirely foreign to you. But you share your embodied platform certainly very specifically with all mammals, and of course you can understand mammals quite well, but you can even really understand lizards to some degree, and especially the more social ones. And so there's this tremendous degree of inbuilt biological structure and biological commonality, and we talked about it most particularly in reference to the hypothalamus, which seems to be the built-in initial sub-personality generator, something like that. And the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating what you might regard as the most fundamental biological elements of behavior, the systems that not only keep you alive, which is obviously very important, but also impel you to do such things as defend yourself, obviously part of survival, and also to reproduce and to explore. And the exploration element's quite interesting, because you think of that as a very sophisticated form of behavior, and it is, but it's rooted in an unbelievably archaic neurophysiology. So the hypothalamus roughly sets you into motivated frames, and then when those frames either fail or when they're all quiescent because they've been satiated, it pops you into an exploratory state of mind, and you wander around exploring, foraging for information, roughly speaking, so that you can update all the sub-personalities that you use to organize your perceptions and frame your emotions and so forth. Now so the hypothalamus throws up these frames. It makes you hungry, it makes you thirsty, it makes you defensively aggressive, it helps regulate your temperature through behavior, and all of those things. Now, the problem with that is that it's a set of impulsive unidimensional systems, each one operating in the moment, and each one only concerned with the satiation of its particular aim, we'll say. And the problem with that is that while you live for more than the moment, you live across many moments, you stretch yourself across time. And we know, human beings know that they stretch across time, and so actually have to consider not only the organization of their behavior in the short term, but also the organization of their behavior in the short term so that it also works across weeks and across months and across years, and maybe even for longer spans of time than that. And also, equally and similarly, it has to work across people. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about that is there actually isn't much difference between establishing a value structure that works for you now and next week and next month and into the future, and establishing a value structure that works for you and other people simultaneously. Because you could say that whoever you are in a year is sort of like another person. And so insofar as you can organize yourself so that other people find what you're doing, let's say, acceptable and valuable, you're also organizing yourself so that perhaps you're acting in the best interests of your future self. And so then you might say, well, if the hypothalamus can organize your being such that you can satiate, satisfy your most basic needs, why do you need the rest of the brain? And the answer to that is, well, it looks like it's to solve the problem of more complex forms of being. So these fundamental biological subsystems have to interact with each other in a productive way. They can't just cycle unidimensionally from motivated state to motivated state. It's not a very effective solution. And not only that, you have to learn to operate in a world with time and with other people. And so that makes the adaptation problem much, much more complex. And it's for that reason, as far as I can tell, and no doubt for other reasons as well, that there's utility in the provision of extra subcortical and cortical resources. And I think the right way to think about the cortex in some ways is actually as living space for the hypothalamus and the subcortical structures. So you know what happens when you develop as a young child, especially in the very early stages of development, the underlying subcortical systems, including the systems for the senses, more or less compete for dominion over the cortical territory. So for example, if you take a kitten and you close one of its eyes shortly after birth and you leave it covered for a number of months, what will happen is the remaining eye will invade both hemispheres' visual representation systems. So that eye becomes, the single remaining eye becomes much more acute and more cortically dominant, like an invader, really like an invader, than the other one does. And then if you uncover the other eye, the cat, after a critical period of development, the cat will never learn to see out of that eye. And so, you know, you've got these underlying biological systems, motivational and sensory, and they're looking to expand themselves as the organism manifests itself in the world, and it does that by occupying cortical territory in a competitive process. So for example, if you're deaf, your visual cortex will become occupied by auditory and tactile processing, because why not? You know, I mean, you can basically see with your hands, you know, and you can, well, I wouldn't say it's not so easy to hear with your eyes, that's harder, although you can hear to some degree with touch, right, because you can feel vibration. All of your senses overlap to a substantial degree, and if one of them is missing, it's perfectly reasonable for the others to occupy the territory that would otherwise be given over to that sense. And this actually has some practical implications even. So silent reading is actually a relatively new ability, evolutionarily speaking. Certainly literacy is a relatively new invention from an evolutionary perspective. But to silent read is to use your eyes as ears. So you know, when you read silently, you can hear the words, so to speak, in your head. And the reason for that, as it turns out, is that the part of the brain that you use to read silently with is right between the visual and the auditory cortexes, right where they overlap. So you are literally, you are using your eyes as ears. And so that's quite the thing, that you can figure out how to do that. So